Picture this. It's January 20th, 1953, and the sun is barely up over Washington. It's cold, the kind of cold that bites through your coat and makes your breath hang in the air like a ghost. Outside the White House, a black limousine sits motionless at the curb. Inside that car is a man who just refuses to move. His name is Dwight David Eisenhower, and he's about to become the President of the United States in just a few hours. But right now, at 8:45 in the morning, he's sitting in the back of that limousine with his jaw set and his mind made up. He will not step foot inside that building. He will not walk through those doors. He will not shake hands with the man waiting for him inside. This isn't some scheduling mix-up or a case of someone running late. This is deliberate. This is calculated. This is one of the most powerful insults ever delivered on what should have been one of the proudest days in American democracy. Inside the White House, standing by a window on the second floor, Harry S. Truman watches that car. He knows exactly what's happening. Eisenhower isn't coming in. The tradition, the courtesy, the simple human decency of having coffee together before heading to the inauguration, all of it is being thrown away. Truman stands there, probably feeling his blood pressure rise, watching a car that simply will not move. And in that moment, you can feel the weight of everything that's been broken between these two men. Now let's talk about who these men actually are, because this story only makes sense when you understand what they meant to America. Dwight Eisenhower is 62 years old. He's the supreme Allied commander of World War II, the man who coordinated the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, the victor who accepted Germany's surrender. When Americans think of military heroes, they think of Eisenhower. He's as popular as any general has been since Ulysses Grant nearly a century earlier. He commanded millions of men across 2 continents. He made decisions that shaped the outcome of the most devastating war in human history. The American people just elected him president with 55% of the vote. He's a hero, a legend, a man who seems larger than life. But on this freezing January morning, he won't walk 20 feet to shake the hand of the man who gave him almost everything he ever achieved. That man inside the White House is Harry Truman, and his story is just as remarkable. Truman made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan. He stared down Stalin during the early years of the Cold War. He created the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. He fired General Douglas MacArthur when MacArthur challenged his authority. And here's the part that makes this whole situation even more bitter. 7 years earlier, in 1945, Truman offered to make Eisenhower president. Not just support him, not just endorse him. Truman was willing to step down from the presidency and become Eisenhower's vice president. Think about that for a second. The sitting president of the United States was willing to take the number 2 spot just to get Eisenhower into the White House. But Eisenhower said no. He said he was a soldier, not a politician. He said he had no interest in politics. He said it wasn't his calling. Then in 1952, Eisenhower changed his mind. He decided he did want to be president after all. But he didn't run as a Democrat with Truman's support. He ran as a Republican against everything Truman had built. And now, on Inauguration Day, he's sitting in a car making the outgoing president come to him like a servant summoned to the curb. But these 2 men weren't always enemies. Once upon a time, they actually respected each other. Back in July 1945, President Truman met General Eisenhower outside Potsdam in Germany. They drove together through the ruins of Berlin, past buildings reduced to rubble, past streets where the smell of destruction still hung in the air. Truman looked at the general sitting beside him and said something extraordinary. He told Eisenhower that there was nothing he could ever want that Truman wouldn't try to help. him get. That included the presidency. Truman meant every word. He had only been vice president for 82 days when Franklin Roosevelt died. Suddenly he was president, responsible for a war on two fronts, responsible for secret atomic weapons he didn't even know existed until after he was sworn in. He felt unprepared. He felt overwhelmed. And he genuinely admired Eisenhower. So he offered him the world. Eisenhower thanked him politely, but said no. He had no political ambitions. He was a soldier. That's who he was. That's all he wanted to be. Truman accepted that answer. Then in 1947, Truman made the offer again. He wrote in his private diary that he wanted Eisenhower to run as a Democrat in 1948. Truman would step aside and run as Eisenhower's vice president. He even wrote that he would be happy to get out of this great white jail known as the White House. But once again, Eisenhower said no. For 5 solid years, from 1947 to 1952, Eisenhower insisted he had absolutely no interest in politics. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, he announced he would seek the Republican nomination for president. The announcement shocked everyone, but it shocked Truman most of all. Eisenhower had turned down multiple offers to run as a Democrat. Now he wanted the presidency. He just didn't want it from Truman. He didn't want it from the Democratic Party. He wanted it on his own terms. But even that wasn't what destroyed their relationship. What Truman could never forgive, what made him truly furious, was what happened during the campaign. And to understand that, we need to talk about George Catlett Marshall. Marshall was the man who made Eisenhower's entire career possible. When World War II started, Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff. Over 6 years, he transformed the United States Army from a force of fewer than 200,000 men into a military machine of over 8 million soldiers. And he saw something special in Dwight Eisenhower. In 1941, Eisenhower was just a lieutenant colonel. He was talented, sure, but he was unknown outside military circles. Marshall promoted him rapidly, jumping him over hundreds of officers who had more experience and more seniority. By 1942, Eisenhower was commanding Allied forces in North Africa. By 1943, Marshall recommended Eisenhower to lead Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. Here's the thing that makes Marshall's support even more remarkable. Marshall had wanted that command for himself. It was the most important military operation of the entire war. It was the moment that would define Allied victory. But President Roosevelt asked Marshall to stay in Washington to coordinate the entire war effort. Marshall agreed without complaint and gave the command to Eisenhower instead. He could have resented Eisenhower. He could have been bitter about losing his chance for glory. Instead, he supported Eisenhower completely. Winston Churchill called Marshall the organizer of victory, and he was right. After the war ended, Truman asked Marshall to serve as Secretary of State. Marshall created the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. It sent over $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe. It stopped communist expansion. It saved millions of people from starvation and economic collapse. In 1953, Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This was not just another government official. This was one of the architects of Allied victory. And this was the man who had made Eisenhower's career possible. Eisenhower owed Marshall everything. So when Senator Joseph McCarthy attacked Marshall, he wasn't just attacking some bureaucrat. He was attacking a hero. And Eisenhower should have defended him. Starting in 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began his crusade. McCarthy had built his entire political career on accusing people of being communist sympathizers. Most of his accusations were completely baseless. Many were deliberately cruel. Some destroyed innocent lives and reputations. And then McCarthy turned his attention to George Marshall. In a speech on the Senate floor, McCarthy spent 60,000 words attacking Marshall. He called Marshall's career a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. These accusations were insane. Marshall had built the army that defeated Nazi Germany. He had created the Marshall Plan that stopped communist expansion in Europe. The idea that Marshall was secretly working for the communists was grotesque and absurd. But McCarthy wasn't alone. Senator William Jenner of Indiana called Marshall a living lie and a frontman for traitors. Truman was absolutely enraged. He called Marshall the greatest living American. And Truman expected Eisenhower to defend Marshall. If anyone should stand up for Marshall against these disgusting smears, it should be Eisenhower. The man owed Marshall everything. But that's not what happened. In October 1952, Eisenhower was scheduled to give a speech in Milwaukee, which was McCarthy's home state. McCarthy was going to be on the stage with him. Eisenhower's staff prepared a speech that included a paragraph defending Marshall. The paragraph was clear and strong. It said that Eisenhower had known Marshall personally for 35 years, that he knew Marshall as a man and a soldier dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America. The paragraph was even released to reporters in advance. The press knew what was coming. Political observers anticipated a dramatic moment where Eisenhower would finally stand up to McCarthy. But then Wisconsin Governor Walter Kohler and Eisenhower's campaign staff urged him to remove the paragraph. They said it would offend McCarthy. It would offend Wisconsin Republicans. They argued it wasn't worth the political cost. Wisconsin was an important state. McCarthy was popular there. Eisenhower needed those electoral votes. And Eisenhower listened. He wanted to win the election. He believed he could do great things as president. To do that, he needed to win. So Eisenhower made a calculation. He decided that winning was more important than defending George Marshall. He deleted the paragraph. On October 3, 1952, Dwight Eisenhower stood on a stage in the Milwaukee arena with Senator Joseph McCarthy standing right beside him. 10,000 people packed the arena. Eisenhower gave his speech. He praised McCarthy's anti-communist efforts. He endorsed McCarthy's crusade. And he said nothing about George Marshall. Not one single word. After the speech ended, McCarthy approached Eisenhower. The photographers were ready, cameras up, waiting for the moment. McCarthy reached out his hand. Eisenhower actually tried to step back, tried to avoid the handshake, but there were people behind him blocking his way. McCarthy was too quick. He grabbed Eisenhower's hand and held it high like a referee raising the hand of a victorious boxer. The cameras flashed. That photograph went across the entire country. Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day, shaking hands with the man who had called his mentor a traitor. The news coverage was absolutely brutal. Reporters knew that Eisenhower had planned to defend Marshall and then deliberately chose not to. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated choice. Eisenhower had weighed defending his mentor against winning Wisconsin. And Wisconsin won. The New York Times ran a front-page story about it. Even some Republicans were disgusted. One Republican editor wrote that Eisenhower had sold his soul for a mess of pottage. Truman's reaction was immediate and furious. He told reporters he had never thought the man who is now the Republican candidate would stoop so low. He said the trouble with Eisenhower is he's just a coward and he ought to be ashamed for what he did. Truman made defending Marshall a central theme of his entire campaign. He reminded audiences everywhere that Marshall had made Eisenhower's career possible. He asked crowds how anyone could trust Eisenhower to stand up to the Soviets if he couldn't even stand up to Joe McCarthy. And here's something else that made it worse. 2 weeks before Milwaukee, Eisenhower had campaigned with Senator Jenner in Indianapolis. Remember, Jenner was the man who had called Marshall a frontman for traitors. Eisenhower appeared on stage with Jenner. He let Jenner embrace him. He smiled for the cameras. He later told his aides that he felt dirty after the event, but he did it anyway. For Truman, this revealed something fundamental about Eisenhower's character. Eisenhower was willing to stand with men who slandered George Marshall because it was politically convenient. If Eisenhower would do that to the man who made his career, what would he do as president? What would he sacrifice for political advantage? The campaign got even worse from there. Eisenhower pledged that he would go to Korea if elected, implying that he could end the war that Truman couldn't finish. Truman called this demagoguery. Republican surrogates attacked Truman's administration as soft on communism and riddled with corruption. Truman hit back by calling Eisenhower a stooge for Wall Street. By election day, the animosity between them was impossible to hide. Eisenhower won in a landslide. He got 55% of the popular vote and 442 electoral votes. After the election, they met once for a transition briefing. Both men approached it with absolute dread. The atmosphere in that meeting was stiff and uncomfortable. Biographer Stephen Ambrose called it embarrassing and unrewarding. Eisenhower listened with visible impatience. He didn't need Harry Truman to tell him how to run an organization. He had commanded millions of men during the war. He later wrote that the meeting added little to his knowledge. After Eisenhower left the White House that day, Truman told his staff that Eisenhower was going to struggle as president. He pointed to the desk and said that Eisenhower would sit right there and say, "Do this, do that," and nothing would happen. "Poor Ike," Truman said. "It won't be a bit like the Army." By Inauguration Day, the tension between them was visible to absolutely everyone in Washington. Clark Clifford, one of Truman's advisors, said the hatred between the two men was like a monsoon. Eisenhower told his associates that he wasn't sure if he could stand sitting next to that guy for the ride to the Capitol. So Eisenhower made his decision. He would not enter the White House. He would stay in the limousine and make Truman come to him. Mamie Eisenhower sat beside her husband in that car. She knew exactly what he was doing. She said nothing. Inside the White House, Truman saw the car sitting outside. He knew Eisenhower wasn't coming. For a moment, it seemed like Truman might refuse to go outside. He could have stayed inside out of pride. But Truman was still the president. He had a responsibility to the country that went beyond his personal feelings. So he swallowed his anger and walked outside. Truman emerged from the north portico of the White House. He walked across the driveway to the car. Eisenhower did not get out. Truman opened the door himself and climbed into the back seat. The two men sat beside each other in that car. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. The car began the slow drive to the Capitol building. The silence inside that car was absolutely suffocating. Both men stared straight ahead like strangers on a bus. Mamie tried making small talk about the weather. It didn't help at all. Then Eisenhower broke the silence. He asked Truman a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. Who had ordered his son John back from Korea for the inauguration? John Eisenhower was 29 years old, a major in the Army, serving with combat units in Korea. The war was still being fought. American soldiers were still dying. Someone had pulled John out of Korea and sent him to Washington for the inauguration. Eisenhower wanted to know who had done it. Truman looked at him and said 2 words. "I did," he explained calmly. "The president thought it was right and proper for your son to witness the swearing in of his father to the presidency." Truman had used his authority as commander-in-chief to make sure John could see his father take the oath of office. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't announce it publicly. He didn't make a big show of it. He just did it because despite his anger, despite everything that had happened between them, Truman believed that some things mattered more than politics. Family mattered. Doing the decent thing mattered. Eisenhower said nothing in response. No thank you. No acknowledgement. He just turned back to looking out the window. Years later, Eisenhower would send a letter thanking Truman. But in that car on that cold morning, he said nothing at all. The ceremony proceeded as planned. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. When it ended, Truman left immediately. He did not attend the inaugural parade. He did not stay for any celebrations. He went straight to Union Station, where 5,000 people had gathered to see him off. They cheered. They shouted his name. Truman boarded a train to Independence, Missouri. He would not return to the White House for 10 years. Eisenhower never invited him back. Not for state dinners. Not for ceremonies. Not for anything. The two men lived in frozen hostility. They did not speak. They did not write to each other. Truman later said he could hardly mention Eisenhower's name without using profanity. Then in October 1959, George Marshall died. His funeral was held at Fort Myer Chapel. Eisenhower attended. Truman attended. They sat in the same pew for the first time since Inauguration Day. Neither man spoke to the other. They sat in complete silence, mourning the man who had meant so much to both of them, the man whose memory had driven them apart. Then something happened that changed everything. In November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The entire nation went into shock. Truman and Eisenhower both came to Washington for the funeral. On November 25th, they rode in the same car to Arlington National Cemetery. During that drive, something shifted. They talked. They discussed whether the assassination was a conspiracy or the act of a lone gunman. They talked like two men who remembered they had once respected each other. After the graveside service, Margaret Truman invited the Eisenhowers to join her father for lunch at Blair House. They accepted. For an hour, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower sat together and actually talked like human beings. They reminisced about old battles. They shared memories. They talked like two old men who had once known each other well. Admiral Ronald Dennison was there, and he later recalled that it was really heartwarming. You would have thought there had never been any differences between them. When it was time to leave, they stood on the sidewalk outside Blair House. They shook hands. It was a long, lingering handshake. Margaret kissed Eisenhower on the cheek. Mamie kissed Truman. 10 years after that cold January morning when Eisenhower refused to enter the White House, they had finally found their way back to something resembling friendship. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969. He had served 2 full terms as president. He built the interstate highway system. He ended the Korean War. He guided America through some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Truman died on December 26, 1972. He returned to independence in 1953 and lived there quietly for nearly 20 years. The story of January 20th, 1953 became a permanent part of American history. The image of Eisenhower refusing to enter the White House became a symbol of how personal grievances can poison public duty. Eisenhower felt betrayed by Truman's campaign attacks and by the accusations of cowardice. Truman felt betrayed by Eisenhower's refusal to defend Marshall and by his willingness to stand with McCarthy. Both men had legitimate grievances. Both had been hurt. Both had reasons to be angry. But both let those grievances override their responsibility to the moment. The inauguration is not about the two men in the car. It's about the peaceful transfer of power. It's about showing the country and the world that American institutions are stronger than any individual's pride or anger. Eisenhower forgot that when he refused to walk through the door. Truman remembered it when he walked out anyway. On that cold January morning in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower sat in a car and refused to enter Harry Truman's White House. The moment passed. The insult landed. The damage was done. And for 10 years, two of the most important Americans of the 20th century stayed apart, divided by pride, divided by anger, divided by the memory of a threshold that neither man would cross until tragedy finally brought them back together.